Yes.
There we go. Okay. Well, welcome everyone. I'm Linda Sechrist, a co-founder and president of the Southwest Florida Reset Center, and I'm happy to welcome you to this evening's talk. Thank you all so much for attending. Some of you with us today may already know what the Southwest Reset Center is, but we are, for those of you who don't, we're dedicated to finding workable solutions to the root causes of our environmental issues, particularly those that address clean water and rebuilding healthy soil. We are a not-for-profit organization with the aim of mitigating or reversing the effects of global warming, which are showing up in our bioregion of 5 counties. We make our home at the Unitarian Universalist Congregation of Fort Myers, which is on Shire Lane. The Reset board members that are here with us today are ordinary people like you and me. And I know that Gary is with us and he's our treasurer. Holly is our secretary. There we go. Only 3 years ago, it seems hard to believe, but only 3 years ago, we were 6 concerned citizens who came together intending to prove the famous anthropologist Margaret Mead that she was right when she said, never forget that a small group of concerned citizens can make a difference, for indeed it is the only thing that ever has. And it's true. We're still working away at it 3 years later. Holly, do you want to share the screen then for what RESET means to everybody? There we go. RESET is an acronym, and this is what it stands for: restorative, ecological, social, economic, and transformation. And the transformation is much for us as it is for the region. So now I want to tell you about our speaker, Gene McAvoy. He's the Extension Agent Emeritus, and he is going to talk to us on what regenerative agriculture practices work well and what don't in Southwest Florida. Gene is an agronomic and horticultural production and marketing specialist with more than 50 years of experience in temperate and tropical environments. So take it away, Gene.
Thank you, Linda, and thank you for inviting me to be here today. I'm going to share my screen. I have a couple slides that I'll show, and then I'll invite questions. All right. Again, we're going to talk about regenerative ag in Southwest Florida. Excuse me, I'm going to... Well, the pictures were blocking my view of the screen.
Oh.
Regenerative ag is based on a number of agricultural and ecological practices, and it places particular emphasis on minimizing soil disturbance and incorporating the process or practice of composting. Is regenerative ag the new sustainable agriculture? And what is it? First thing we need to know that there isn't one universally accepted definition of regenerative ag. And if you research the subject, it's actually difficult to pin down a clear definition. Most growers and agricultural scientists are interested in sustainable, efficient farming practices that allow them to feed more people while preserving natural resources. The National Resource Defense Council defines regenerative ag as a philosophical and approach to land management, which considers all aspects of agriculture, or how all aspects of agriculture are connected through a web or a network of entities who grow, enhance, exchange, distribute, and consume goods or services. Again, there's no real strict rule book, but the holistic principles behind regenerative ag are aimed at restoring soil and ecosystem health, addressing inequity, and hopefully leave our land, water, and climate in better shape for future generations. Again, there's many definitions of regenerative ag, but there are several basic principles. One is enhancing and improving soil health. Second would be optimizing resource management. Third is alleviation of climate change. And fourth is improvement of water quality and availability. Again, regenerative ag is built on a set of biological and ecological principles focused on soil health. It aims at increasing biodiversity, improving nutrient and water cycling, enhancing ecosystem services, supporting carbon biosequestration, increasing climate resilience, and enhancing the overall social and economic sustainability of the farming enterprise. Again, some basic principles: reducing mechanical and chemical disturbance, keeping soils covered, maximizing diversity, trying to keep a living root in the ground year-round, and integrating crop and livestock operations. Again, soil health is a major priority, and soil health affects everything from plant health to human well-being and the future of our planet. But regenerative ag goes beyond that and encompasses standards for animal welfare and worker fairness. And the idea is to create farm systems that work in harmony with nature to improve the quality of life for every creature involved. Regenerative ag can help combat climate change. It's conventional ag practices such as plowing and tilling reduce carbon dioxide from the soil by exposing organic matter to the surface and promoting oxidation. It's estimated that about a third of the man-made inputs of CO2 to the atmosphere since the Industrial Revolution have come from the degradation of soil organic matter. And some studies suggest, but there's a lot of discussion and debate over this, that a worldwide transition to regenerative ag could fix more than 100% of the CO2 currently emitted by people. Again, is it new? If you look, over historical practices, indigenous cultures have practiced many of these principles of regenerative ag for millennia. The yearbook, if you look back at the yearbooks of US Department of Agriculture yearbooks of agriculture, way back until the early 1900s, they promote the principles of regenerative ag. And these are principles like crop rotation, use of organic amendments, practicing cover cropping, using integrated pest management, which reduces a reliance on pesticides and emphasizes biocontrol. These are all mainstays of regenerative ag and of modern agriculture. There are some global realities we have to face, though. As I mentioned, indigenous people did practice many of these principles. But on the other hand, and I've lived and worked in many of these countries for nearly 14 years, there are over 700 million people or so on the planet who still live in extreme poverty. They don't use synthetic fertilizers, and they don't use most other modern technologies, not by choice, but because they can't afford them. So in practicing regenerative ag, we need to move beyond old-fashioned subsistence farming, where the world's poorest eke out their survival from the soil. Okay, population growth is something we have to deal with. And, if you look at world population, look at Florida, we've gone from 1 million people to 22 million people in the last 100 years. That's about 584 people every day for 100 years. US population has gone from 75 to 333 million. And worldwide, it's estimated that world populations will increase in the next 50 years from 7 billion currently to over 9 billion people. And in the next 50 years, we're going to have to produce more food to feed this population than we did in the last 10,000 years put together. using less resources. So there's a tremendous challenge, and that's limits to some extent, what we can do and what we cannot do. Organic regenerative farming is not organic farming, but they do regenerative farmers make an effort to reduce reliance on synthetic inputs, such as herbicides, pesticides, and chemical fertilizers. And just to give some cost comparisons, conventional farmer that uses chemicals, for instance, they may spray, if they're growing, say, cabbage or corn, caterpillars are a big problem. On an organic farm, they spray products like soaps and oils. And if you look at the cost and the environmental footprint, oftentimes when pest pressure is high, then they spray every day or every other day. And if you look at the cost of that, if you spray water, it costs about $35 an acre. You add the cost of the soap, and that's another $20. So you got $55 an acre. And if you spray every day of the week, that's 7 times 55, which is $385 approximately. If you use a conventional chemical or that may give you 7 to 10 days control, you're going to have $35 in the cost of spraying. You're going to have maybe another $35 or $40 for the chemical. So you're only spending $70 to $80 a week. And if you look at the carbon footprint, every time you run that tractor, you're using gasoline, you're using fossil fuels. So sometimes, you have to look at these, benefits and, weigh the cost. And a similar example would be organic amendments. Hauling organic matter is very costly, especially if you have to haul it far. I have a number of farmers that do use organic amendments. One of my growers was offered horse manure from the polo ponies over in Palm Beach County. And if you don't know this, it's a huge business. It's about a $350 million business. And this time of year, they fly in horses from all around the world to compete in Palm Beach County. And they generate a tremendous amount of manure, which is a solid waste disposal issue. The logical place to put that on farms is on farms. But if a farmer has to haul it, he can't afford to use it. And my farmer was eventually able to, work with the polo club and explain the economics of it. And they realized that, if they wanted to dispose of the manure in a sustainable way, they had to bring it to him because he couldn't afford to haul it and then use it. So sometimes we have to look at cost. Another thing that, sometimes we use pesticides, for instance, a number of grain farmers, they use genetically engineered crops that naturally fight off pests. And these are quite practical, innovative tools. Glyphosate combined with genetically engineered crops has allowed many farmers to reduce or eliminate tillage as a form of weed control, significantly cutting CO2 emissions. In 2018 alone, no-till farmers who cultivated GE crops reduced their carbon emissions by 23 billion kilotons, which is the equivalent of pulling 15.3 million cars off the road. So again, we have to look at, the cost, the benefit, and the trade-offs. Sustainability has many definitions, but to a farmer who's a business person, the bottom line is being able to pay your bills at the end of the year. And as a good business person, they're continuously seeking ways to reduce costs while maximizing inputs. And they have to take into account economics. I gave a couple of examples of economics. I can give more. The environment that we work in. For instance, our environment is subtropical. It's hot, it's humid. Organic matter breaks down rather quickly in our environment. Practices that work in the Midwest where, cover cropping and no-till can help build up tremendous amounts of soil organic matter. You can add compost here in Florida, and I have one farmer who at one time was trying to build his organic matter in his soil, which our soils naturally contain less than 1% organic matter, except for places like the Everglades agricultural area. And he was putting out 35 tons of compost a year and still couldn't get his organic matter above 1% because it oxidizes so rapidly and converts back to CO2 and oxygen. So really, in some ways, he was doing a disservice to the environment. We have to look at biology. Again, practices that might work elsewhere may not work here. Again, because of our hot, humid climate, we have very heavy insect and disease pressure. We don't have winter. Winter in more northern areas kills a lot of insects and diseases, allows you to start with a clean slate every year. Regulations play a role. And again, a logical place to put human sewage sludge is on the ground and use it to grow crops. But in some area, in most of Florida, kick or pushback against the use of that product has resulted in it being disallowed in most situations. Should have been regulated more highly and more controlled, and it could have been a good product if it was handled properly. And then we have consumer and market demands. For instance, use of pesticides to control insects. Really, if a piece of corn has a little, chewing damage on it, or, the tomato is less than perfect, there's really nothing wrong with it. But most consumers will not accept it. The market, if you're selling to commercial markets like Whole Foods or Publix or whoever, they're not going to accept product that's less than perfect. So again, that also plays a role. And our crops tend to be here in Florida, very high value, high risk. To grow tomatoes in Florida costs about $12,000 an acre, just up to the time that you start to pick them. So with that kind of money out, 100 acres of tomatoes is $1.2 million. You're going to do what you have to do to protect that tremendous investment. That's versus Iowa, for instance, where about $650 an acre to grow field corn. Again, some of the regenerative claims are marketing. Claim is that regenerative agriculture means that farmers are economically viable, able to invest in soil health, clean water, strong ecosystems. And again, these are all commendable goals, but farmers have been trying to do this stuff for a long time without fancy labels or certification schemes. They try to use the best practices that will sustain their farm over the long term, both environmentally and economically, and it's really just good business. Some of the new technologies that are emerging are very exciting. They are enabling farmers to do more with less. Our farmers in this country especially cannot compete on the basis of cheap land or labor. They must compete on the basis of technology. Precision GPS guided equipment, cloud-based technologies are all coming into play. Improved genetics, for instance, have increased yields while providing resistance to pests and diseases that allow us to use fewer pesticides. Just in my lifetime, the average yield of tomatoes here in Florida has gone from 25,000 pounds to over 70,000 pounds. And they're much more resistant to many of the diseases that used to plague us that allow us to use fewer pesticides. Another example is peppers. Peppers, through conventional breeding, scientists have incorporated resistance to bacterial leaf spot. Bacterial leaf spot to successfully grow peppers in Florida used to have to spray 26 times a season just to control the one disease. Now with resistance to these diseases, we can get by with less than 6 sprays. Genetics also allow greater heat, drought, and cold tolerance. And again, it can be achieved in various ways, either through conventional breeding or genetic engineering. Big thing that's going on now is smart sprayers. Again, in the past, we used to just spray the entire field because that's the technology we had available. Now we use smart sprayers, and they can result in a 90% reduction in chemical usage, which is good for the economic viability of the operation and good for the environment at the same time. In citrus, we use smart sprayers that turn off nozzles to apply precise amount of product. You know, for tall trees, you have all the nozzles on. When the tree's small, they'll turn most of them off. If they detect no tree, they turn off completely. With drip irrigation and microjet irrigation, we are using less than 30% of the water that we formerly used. And we control the irrigation with a smartphone and sensors. So again, when I was at the research station in Immokalee, I can tell if a field needed water by contacting sensors embedded in the field on my phone. And if it did, I could turn that irrigation on or off. One of the things that's really going to help spur this whole economic or regenerative ag movement is the provision of economic incentives. Again, there needs to be a reason that a grower does this, beyond some of the reasons I talked about. And some big companies are moving in that direction. General Mills, Whole Foods, PepsiCo, Target, Land O'Lakes, and Walmart have all announced initiatives to provide growers with incentives. And they're working with growers right now on over 68 million acres. There are also certification programs out there. And the question is, will they translate to higher return for growers? USDA, through the National Resource Conservation Service, I've misspelled that, should be NRCS, provides incentives for doing many of the practices that are part of regenerative ag. The SARE program that I mentioned earlier, they also provide farmer-driven grassroots grants and education programs. And since 1988 have been putting principles of sustainable ag into practice on farms and ranches in every state and island protectorate. Again, agriculture does provide intangible benefits that we need to recognize and should not be discounted. Over 9 million acres are in agriculture in Florida. The state of Florida has 26 million acres, 9 million in agriculture, 9 million in preservation areas, and about 6 million in urban and suburban areas. And again, agricultural lands provide population or places for wildlife and native plant systems to thrive. Agriculture also benefits our citizens because through aquifer recharge. Unlike most of North Florida, which utilize the Floridan aquifer, much of the southern part of the state, especially south of I-4, depends on the water that falls on the ground during the summer rainy season. And if we don't have open ground to collect that water, filter that water, and recharge our aquifers, we're going to run out of water. And in some places we already are, and agriculture can help provide that service. In some areas we're practicing water farming, where growers are actually being subsidized a small amount, $25 an acre, to hold water on their property in the rainy season to prevent it from running and traveling to ecologically sensitive areas and reduce discharges to the coastal areas. In the Tampa area, we're seeing trading of agricultural water for urban use. Tampa is rapidly running out of water, and they're working with farmers in adjacent counties like Pasco County to purchase water rights so that they can provide water for their citizens. And more efficient irrigation coupled with the use of reclaimed water can result in more water for public supply. Carbon sequestration, again, we know that agriculture can be a solution by implementing certain practices. And as a result, farmers are now hearing about terms like carbon credits, carbon financing, carbon payments. And again, big companies like Amazon, Walmart, and private investors are looking to invest in agriculture or incentivize agriculture to implement practices that help increase the amount of carbon that's fixed into the soil. So with that, I'll take any questions.
There are some pretty good questions
There's
in
a
the
bunch of
chat.
questions.
Yeah, so maybe you could start with those if you want.
Okay, we'll start at the beginning.
And then at some point, I'd like to talk a little bit about the hurricane and all the mud as compost that's come out of the river onto our gardens.
Okay, Rhonda had a comment. If you try to use monoculture crops, no resistance, you may need toxic pesticides, but if you alternate crops in rows, we can do that to some extent, but the practicality of feeding large numbers of people that we're trying to do in this country, that works in your backyard. It works for, small systems, but it just doesn't work that well in reality. Liz. Okay, I don't, Liz, do you want me to share that? It's a direct message, not to everyone, so maybe I'll just skip over that one and wait till Liz tells me yes or no. Rhonda Ross, glyphosate kills seagrasses and the gut flora of manatees, so already starving manatees do not have sufficiently gut biodiversity. Two giant deaths, meager remnants of seagrasses, the glyphosate together with excess nutrients would escape from sandy soil matrix have killed. And yes, that's a concern. But glyphosate, on the other hand, does break down rapidly and binds to soil particles. And if used properly, we can reduce that. Question for Gene is in Florida, South Florida, a special case. What could we grow without toxic pesticides and GMOs? The land below the lake is historically oligotrophic, low nutrient content.
So what do you think does grow the best, say in Southwest Florida?
If you want to reduce pesticides and GMOs, extensive ranching.
I've heard that answer before.
Extensive ranching.
And how does that help us with
using native
climate change solution?
Well, grasses and that extensive type ranching helps build soil organic matter to the extent possible in our environment. By using native range, and by native range that means native grasses, trees, and shrubs, and not introduced grasses. We can use much less water, hardly any fertilizer. I own a ranch. I never apply fertilizer. I balance my property to the number of cattle that the land will support, which in much of this area is between 4 and 8 acres per cow calf pair. I rarely, if ever, buy feed. The only time I buy feed for my animals is if we have a hard freeze or frost, which kills back the grass for 6 or so weeks. And at that time, I need to supplement the feed to the animals. But otherwise, most years I don't buy any feed. The years that I do buy feed, I don't make any money because I spend all my profit on buying feed. So that would be one type of crop. But most of our food crops, no. And then, the question is, what's better for the environment, to buy tomatoes from Mexico, where people are paid $9 a day, where, just to get them to Florida is over 2,000 miles, using chemicals that have been banned in this country for dozens of, or 30 or 40 years. So it's a difficult question, very difficult question. Rhonda, just to continue, said the Farm Bill is up for its 5-year renewal in 2023, which is true. And the Biden administration, and you could research this, has promoted a number of goals, and many of them have to do with being more sustainable, being more climate friendly, and they're putting money into encouraging, incentivizing growers to shift to put aside lands for I want to say butterfly, but not for natural predators and natural parasites that can help control pests and diseases. And many of our farmers are doing that. I have farmers that are planting or leaving a part of their farm and planting nectar crops that encourage the presence of beneficial insects that prey on the pest insects. And they, by doing that, can reduce greatly the amount of pesticides that they use. So again, I think, some of those should be our goal. Soil food web. I'm not familiar with Dr. Elaine, but I know, and this is, a phenomenon in agriculture that's been going on for the last several years, or, a dozen years or more, is we know more about the surface of the moon than we know about the soil under our feet. And, if you look at a cubic centimeter of soil, it contains millions of microorganisms, hundreds of thousands of fungal species, tens of thousands of actinomycetes that, have health-giving properties, bacteria, and many of these are beneficial, just like we talk about beneficial insects. If we can learn how to harness those, that can help us reduce. Some of them, for instance, colonize the roots, and instead of having to use fumigants, and many of our farmers have foregone the use of fumigants, they're using a number of these biological products. For instance, they colonize roots and they're antagonistic against disease-causing organisms that help the plant extract nutrients more efficiently from the soil. And a number of big companies, and I'm talking about like Bayer's and big chemical companies, they're investing hundreds of millions of dollars in this technology because they realize that chemicals are are going away, for environmental reasons, for other reasons, and they're investing a lot of money in this. And research is being done in this area at the Southwest Florida Research and Education Center. Dr. Sarah Strauss is a soil microbiologist, and a couple of years ago, when growers were asked what they needed the most, one of those positions was a soil microbiologist to help them understand the dynamics of the soil and how they can harness some of these things. Let's see, marshes. What are trends showing over time? We have lost over 15,000 acres of ag in the DRGR. Please help me. Not DRGR.
That's the density reduction groundwater recharge
Oh,
area.
okay, yeah. That's something that voters have to deal with. And why was that lost? It's Lee and Collier and many of most of Florida is built on growth and development. And 10 years ago, I would have thought we never would have seen that, the way people were talking, but it's happening quickly. I just learned recently 23,000 acres of Duda here in LaBelle has been sold to FPL for a solar farm. So again, it's taking, land out of agriculture. Hopefully that'll have some impact on climate, but it also has impacts, that land is also home to panthers and bears and, a lot of indigenous wildlife, and they don't mix very well with a solar farm.
Can things be grown underneath solar or in between solar fields? Like when I've
No.
seen the ones at Babcock Ranch, it just goes on and on.
Yeah, the only thing I've heard of, Holly, is like grazing sheep, smaller animals on the grasses and, herbs that grow under and around. And actually some solar farms work with sheep or goat producers because it's a much more sustainable way of, you have to control those grasses,
Yeah.
they're left unchecked, they pose a fire hazard in the dry season, and mowing or using chemicals to control the grasses is expensive and not very,
Yeah, that
especially
makes sense. They're doing that in California some.
Yeah, they're
With
doing it in
goats and
places.
sheep. Yeah. There's some great questions in here. You're doing a good job. Just
Next question is, how can we stop nutrient fueled algal blooms in springs and coastal waters? Enforceable BMPs and VMAPs. Again, yeah, I think 85% of our farmers are now enrolled in this. Not to be controversial, but I would dare say that if every citizen did as much as agriculture has done to reduce the nutrients that are coming off of their property, we'd be much further along. If you look at Lake Okeechobee, 95% of the nitrogen and 97% of the phosphorus are coming from north of the lake. So we really need to address that problem, But again, I think, a combination. What are some, I think I might have skipped one here, hang on.
one question was your great slideshow. A couple of people have asked if you would be able to share it with all of us.
Sure, that's fine.
And
Yes,
so
ma'am.
you could send it to us at Reset, and then we plan to email everybody that registered for this.
Okay,
As
I'll probably
follow-up.
send you a PDF version because
Perfect.
it may be too big to go by email in the PowerPoint form.
Yeah, either way, but a PDF deck works for a lot of people. That's great, Gene. Thank you.
Okay. See, Marcia, is there an active land use database for analytics in regard to ag lands and regenerative ag? I'm not aware of one. USDA may have something, but cutbacks in federal funding and state funding, we actually have gone backwards in quantifying what ag is doing in both the state and at the national level.
Can you talk to us a little bit, Gene, about saltwater intrusion? I mean, it's really on my mind right now since saltwater came over and inside my house a lot, and a lot of us here. But what's going on with our soils, even inland, as far as groundwater, surface water, and saltwater intrusion, and how is that going to affect agriculture for the future of Florida?
It's going to impact agriculture. Saltwater intrusion tends to be more of a problem in the coastal areas, especially in the lower East Coast. A lot of that area depended on free flow of water through Lake Okeechobee and into the Everglades to provide a hydrological head that kept salt water out of the aquifers. And as right now we have over 8 million people between Miami-Dade, Broward, and Palm Beach County, and they use a lot of water. and they've had to move wells inland, and we are seeing problems even north of there into Martin and St. Lucie counties with saltwater intrusion impacting agriculture, less so on the west coast of Florida. But once the salinity of water gets above about 800 parts per million salinity, it's very difficult to grow most crops. Once it hits 2000, it'll start to kill things. And even in central Florida and places like LaBelle, because of, in the past, there were a lot of artesian wells that were used in Florida. Most of those artesian wells have stopped flowing because the hydrological head that provided the pressure is gone because of drainage of the land, because of drawdown in, aquifers through, agriculture, through urban, industrial usages. Most of those are no longer functional. And what's happened though is many of those artesian wells were abandoned, and they were drilled using old technology. Basically cast iron pipes were, pushed into the ground, and these wells have been forgotten about, but they provide a conduit between aquifers. And we're seeing in some areas, and east of Punta Gorda is a particularly in the Babcock, or east of Babcock even, almost 50 miles from the coast, farmers are having a hard time growing crops because of upwelling of salt water from lower aquifers that are saline. Even here in LaBelle, when I first moved to the property that I'm not on now, I play around as a horticulturist, with a little tree nursery that I used to put native trees and shrubs on my own property. And I was watering them from my well. And the more I watered, the uglier and, further, the plants deteriorated. And, it took me a couple of weeks to realize what was going on. I took water from my own well and took it to our lab at the research station. And I had almost 2,000 parts per million of salt in the well. Again, here I am 50 miles away. This is water that, 50 years ago was used for agriculture and was quite good water. So again, we're impacting our aquifers across the board. And so I now luckily have a small pond on the property, and that's replenished by rainwater, and that's my source of water for plants. For our household use, we have gone to a whole house reverse osmosis system to, provide adequate drinking water.
I see Rhonda has a hand up again.
Yeah, it was just quickly, I ran into a similar situation. I had a house in Delray, Gene, and I understood it was a connate zone, one of those little pockets of salt remnant from when we were under the ocean.
That's possible too. There are some of those.
Right. So I wasn't sure if the entire area around you, I don't know where in LaBelle you are, but
I'm halfway between LaBelle and Immokalee.
so do you know that your neighbors also have that high conductivity? I mean, 2000 I don't really consider to be saline, but
Well, for plants, it's
yeah, but you
expensive.
can't you couldn't taste it, right?
No, you can't taste it.
No.
And animals can drink it. It doesn't bother animals and things like that. But
Right.
it builds up in the soil, and over time, through evaporation, concentrates in the upper layers of the soil and makes it difficult to grow plants.
Yeah. I wasn't sure if that was an indication of the, like a broad area problem, or if it was just like a little connate pocket.
It could be. I'm not 100% sure.
Yeah. Okay.
Let's see.
I see Betty
Soil
has
carbons.
Oh, go ahead. Go ahead, Gene.
Rhonda had another question about soil carbon sequestration. Again, that works a lot better in more northern climates than it does in Florida. And You know, that's where a lot of that kind of regenerative approach is going on. And, you know, the prairie soils, if, you know, you historically, those soils were, you know, really super rich, had, you know, 20 to 30% organic matter that had built up under those grasslands that, you know, existed for millennia. And by practicing regenerative ag, we can, you know, reverse that process. Here in Florida, doesn't work so well. You know, if you look in some of our native areas, you know, what do we call the sand under pine trees, sugar sand? There's just, you know, other than hammocks and, you know, some places like the Everglades and some pockets of muck, you know, up around Sebring and Lake Placid, it's awful difficult to sequester a lot of carbon in Florida soils. What we can do is sequester carbon in product and move that product off the land. And that could be, you know, forest trees. That could be grass that's, you know, turned into beef and then moved to another part of the country. Raina asked, what can non-farmers do to aid in the growth of biodiversity?
Good question.
Stop having 100% of your yard in turf grass is a big movement. You know, and if you do, you know, it's nice to have a little grass around your yard, but you know, what I've done in my front yard now is sunshine mimosa, which is a leguminous plant that fixes nitrogen. It requires no fertilizer. It's, you know, 100% drought tolerant. I never water it. You know, and even a mix of weeds and grass. Now, you know, again, that works in some areas, but if you live in a gated community, your neighbors might not tolerate that kind of approach. Use more native plants. Use pollen, you know, plants that are, you know, used by pollinators or other beneficial insects. And there's a number of resources out there. You know, the University of Florida, EDIS, their electronic dissemination of information system, has a number of publications on native trees, native shrubs, native plants that, you know, you can incorporate into your landscape. You know, if you want to invite me back someday in the future, I have a whole presentation on, you know, native plants and, you know, incorporating those into your garden. How many farmers are actually practicing regenerative ag? Liz's question. And again, I think most farmers are practicing aspects of regenerative ag. And again, you know, regenerative ag has, you know, a number of definitions. I think most are practicing those aspects that are economically viable and environmentally feasible for their situation. It makes a lot of sense. What's the Farm Bill doing? I mentioned that already. The Biden administration has a number of initiatives. If you know, Google USDA and climate change, you could learn more about those. USDA tends to use the term sustainable agriculture rather than regenerative ag, but you know, in many ways, the two are quite synonymous. So again, you can learn more about that. Benefits of agroforestry here and wetliculture. Agroforestry is difficult. For instance, you know, you could grow, I was going to say citrus, but citrus is just about gone from the state of Florida. You know, an area in warmer areas, you could plant, you know, trees like mangoes or, you know, others, and plant crops in between them. But the yield per acre and the, you know, it's very difficult to manage that. You know, is there a data source for the monetary value of trees, varieties? I don't know I'm sure there is. And I'm sure if you got with some of the people at the Food and Resource Economic Department at the University of Florida, they would have more information. Dr. Kim Morgan in Immokalee is an economist, and as is Dr. Tara Wade. And Tara, actually, her background is resource economics, and she's done a lot of work in the economic benefit, for instance, of maintaining wetlands and using wetlands as a sink for nutrients on agricultural properties. And I've seen numbers that she's generated. I don't have them at my fingertips. United Nations, Bonnie says, FAO says modern agriculture produces enough calories to feed 10 billion. If we have 8 billion and many still lack food, is it wise to push for more food production, or is there a better solution? And again, that's a political question. Again, I've worked and lived in many countries around the world. Resources are not well distributed. I wish I knew the answer. I devoted 14 years of my life in West Africa, South Africa, and the Caribbean to trying to address some of those issues. It would be wise to produce, push for more equitable systems of resource allocation, but how to do that. If you look at many of the other countries, so-called, lesser developed countries, a lot of food that's produced is lost. We produce the calories, but in many countries, because of lack of refrigeration, because of lack of distribution, because of pest and disease management difficulties, up to 50% of the food produced is lost and never makes it to the people. You look at countries like Nigeria, oil-rich country. It's estimated that if the monies that some of their leaders have socked into Swiss banks were equally distributed to all the people in the country, everybody in the country would be a millionaire. 52 million people. So I don't know the answer to that one, unfortunately. Push to produce new perennial crops as opposed to annuals. There is a small movement. One of the things that's going on here in Florida in North Florida is carinata, which is a oilseed crop that can be used as a biofuel. In South Florida, Hongamia is currently being promoted. It's an oilseed that can either go for biofuel or as an edible oil. It fits right into citrus properties. There is some people looking at it. Southern Garden Citrus has a small plantation. Another big citrus producer on the East Coast has about 100 acres. Seems not to have a lot of pests and diseases, seems not to require a lot of resources. But again, sometimes it takes a while for these things to get off the ground.
Could you spell the name of the carinata?
Carinata, Carinata.
That's a new one for me. I got to do some more research.
It's a relative of rapeseed or canola, but it's more suited to southern climates than canola is more to prairie provinces in Canada and upper Midwest. Canadian tomatoes and chemicals. I assume Canadian tomatoes are referring to greenhouse tomatoes, because it's hard to grow tomatoes in most parts of Canada for most of the year. again, by moving production indoors, you can reduce some of the chemical use by excluding,
Mhm.
physically excluding pests and by controlling the environment in the greenhouse to some extent.
So,
Let's see, is there a way to share the PowerPoint? We addressed that. Can aquifers be supplemented with ASR wells to prevent saltwater intrusion?
good
I
question.
believe that is possible. Unfortunately, this is Betty. Unfortunately, Florida has passed its carrying capacity. What we are seeing is impacting water quality, a push to develop ag lands and ag lands that are important and, important to sequester carbon, lands that help cushion, absorb impact from natural events such as hurricanes. Plus, we're seeing more wildlife gravitating to ag lands because of the loss of wild landscapes, and these landscapes are submerged. And I agree 100% with Betty that we need to do a better job. And, unfortunately, here in Florida, if you don't provide, if ag is not profitable, the landowners are going to go to the next use. And, that's what we're seeing. I mentioned that Duda just sold 23,000 acres to FPNL. That's a result of citrus greening. They no longer can make enough money to keep the land in agriculture, so they went to another use. Betty goes on, we need more efforts to reclaim nutrients from the water. Lake Okeechobee harvesting plants and an application on land. And yes, that, Mike Elfbein is working on that. It works well in, areas close to the lake. If you have to start transporting that material 20 or 30 miles, it can then become a little more problematic because of the economics of freight. It's expensive to move product. But one thing along those lines, and this is something that Dr. Sanjay Shukla in Immokalee is working on, by law, any farm that's been developed in the last 30 years has to set aside 20, 30, sometimes the larger percent of the land for aquifer recharge, detention and retention areas. So if you right now go out and want to develop 100 acres as a farm, the water management district is going to make you put about 30 acres of that land into retention. And the reason for that is to successfully practice agriculture, you have to control water here in Florida a lot of times of the year. And we just went, ending the rainy season, but for, 5 or 6 months of the year, we have more water. And, I live in a place that it really has never been drained. And my property, for 8, 9, 10 weeks, some summers, of my 40 acres, 39 and a half are underwater, anywhere from ankle deep to knee deep. So if you want to practice ag, you have to get rid of that water. Cows don't mind it. They find the high spots in the wet period. And it is actually a benefit for cattle in that I have grass year round because the land is moist. But for ag, you have to get rid of that water. And so you can't pump it onto your neighbor. So you have to put it into a reservoir and let it percolate back into the aquifer. And by planting aquatic vegetation in those reservoirs, Dr. Shukla is showing where you can remove a lot of the nutrients from the water and actually provide a benefit. And that vegetation could be harvested periodically, and that muck that accumulates can be harvested periodically and reapplied to the farm as a low-cost form of fertilizer.
That's really awesome, Gene. I just want to say that where the Reset Center is located, just off I-75 Daniels Parkway, we're on 12 and a half acres of land. And we were looking at, we have raised beds for 67 community gardens, but it does flood in that area. We're really part of a slough, so it's very seasonal and very wet. But those beds have been okay because they're raised up, and we
That's
keep
right.
And so Bonnie Clancy and I were trying to build and build and rebuild that soil inside the bed, even though it's an area that is flooded for during the rainy season.
Right. And
It's
you know, a lot
working
of
out okay, but
farmers,
that's small scale. That's a really small scale. We're just growing food for ourselves in 3 food pantries.
well, and a lot of farmers are realizing that natural flooding is a natural form of pest and weed control.
Yes.
And, you know, many farmers are now allowing their fields to flood in the summer because they find it controls things like nematodes. They don't like, they drown.
Yeah.
It controls certain weeds. You know, certain weeds like sedges, it doesn't control very well, but, you know, your broadleaf weeds, some of your grasses, it does control. And a number of, you know, insects that, you know, live in the soil also controlled by that. So,
Yeah,
um,
it's making me think of the ancient Egyptians with the Nile overflowing
yeah, yeah,
and the agriculture that they were able to manage. I believe they rotated their crops as well.
okay.
Yeah.
And Rhonda, you had a question about fleet farming, and I'm not sure what that means. So you have to educate me.
Oh, yeah.
There were a group of people up in Orlando that were, I think Chris Castro started this. They would come in and turn your front yard into a vegetable garden for your own use. And a lot
Okay,
of this was during COVID. I mean, it predated COVID, but it really took off during COVID because people were home
right,
and they were
right.
gardening. They were so um, they got past a lot of homeowner associations that wouldn't allow them to plant anything but lawns. So it was really kind of cool. I don't know how far out of Orange County they've ever spread, but I thought it was a super cool initiative, especially given how separated our like urban humanity is from its source of food.
Yeah, no, haven't heard the term, but I'm familiar with that movement in the Orange County area. I know some of the county agents that have worked closely with them. Yeah, I think it's great, you know, and anything like that that, you know, helps connect people back with the natural environment and gives them an awareness of, you know, what it takes to grow food and, you know, reduces.
I think we should start I think maybe reset. Holly, I think we should start a franchise.
Something. We should start something and all work together statewide.
We
So,
had somebody for a while who was doing that, and then she left town, I think. Remember, there were some younger people from FGCU that showed up at our drawdown or whatever, and that's what they were doing.
yeah, they were trying to work on that.
Yeah.
So I'd say it's a movement that I think each of our counties, because I know in this Zoom we're from a lot of different counties here, which makes me very happy that we're having a statewide conversation. Um, you know, just one other, I have a question too, or it's sort of a statement, but you know, a lot of river mud came into our homes by the Caloosahatchee River, where I live in Fort Myers. A lot of homes were destroyed, of course,
Mhm.
trees uprooted, but my house is one up from the river and it filled up with about this much mud after the water receded.
Right.
And I shoveled and cleaned it all out, and I was so worried about my health, but I didn't get sick from it at all, really. And so a reporter came here and she took the mud from our house and she took it to the water school, and she found out that there was no cyanobacteria in that mud, that there wasn't even a high salt content, but there were diatoms, which are a source of life. And as I was scooping out the mud and other people were helping me, we spread it around our bamboo and other plants, and we didn't know whether it was going to kill them or help them. But guess what? Everything is growing up through that river mud. It is like awesome. And so I just wanted to tell that story about the river mud because a lot of people were really afraid of it. And it's turning out to be really nice compost. Just grass is growing up through where we,
Yeah.
you know, all kinds of things are just flourishing. Nature is so resilient and regenerative.
I'll tell you, the best garden I ever had in South Florida was, I used to live on Pine Island, and behind our property was a drainage ditch. and that drainage ditch would go dry in the winter months. And one winter, I was a little younger then and more energetic. I took probably 3 months to shovel all the mud out of that ditch
Yeah,
onto the back of my property into a raised bed that I made with railroad ties.
that's smart.
And that was the most productive garden I've ever had.
This is cool. I'm looking for the silver lining in everything right now. But that mud, I started out hating it, and I ended up just loving it. Just
Mhm.
loving the mud. Just
Mhm.
like Betty's left, but Betty advised some of us before Hurricane Ian came to greet each band of that hurricane with love and respect and openness instead of trying to push it away with our as if we can.
Mhm.
And it really, it's all how we experience this disaster. I think it's really a wake up call for all of us. And so I'm wondering, as we come to a close, if you have anything that you want to say about this hurricane and other hurricanes that are most likely going to come and more storm surge.
Well,
What's our future and how should we deal with this? Should we be leaving Florida, some of us, or should we stay here and work for regenerative agriculture and climate change here?
I
That's
think
my
we, I
question.
think we need to, although I must say, they used to grow tomatoes on Sanibel Island in the teens and early 20s. And in 1926, there was a hurricane that, kind of like Ian,
Hmm.
went right over Sanibel with several feet of water. And that put an end to farming on Sanibel for decades because the land was so contaminated with salt.
Salt, yeah. We were lucky to be on the river and not the Gulf here.
Right. Yeah, I think we're going to see that, more frequently and more violent, more intense.
Holly, do you want to pull up the
Sure.
screen for our future? Jean, I want to thank you so much for enlightening all of us on a lot of different things. I thought this was so interesting. I'm sure everybody else did too. You could tell by the questions. So these are our conversations, reset conversation, and our fall gardening festival. So
Yeah.
our next conversation is with Lisette Morales and Lupita. Down the garden path, that's a little bit of art, a little bit of gardening, some photography. And so I think we're really looking forward to that on November 13th. And then we have our fall gardening festival, our seed and plant exchange. And that's going to be really, really interesting. I hope everybody can show up for that.
I'll go back.
Yeah, we lost something there.
Yeah, I just clicked on this link. This is a beautiful page.
Yeah.
And we'll keep adding our speakers and our presenters. And we really want to encourage people to come and trade as well as sell. So vendors are great, but for a circular economy, I'm trying to get back to that. There
Okay.
you go.
Yeah.
There we go. Back to that.
So,
And then next.
and then we're so excited. Win Everham is going to talk to us about post Ian plans. Will we build a more sustainable future or will we just build back fast? So y'all want to join us and hear what he has to say because he spent his career studying such things. So thank you so much, Jean. I really, really, really appreciate it. I know you're a busy man. I try to track you down. So
You're
Yeah,
quite welcome, and I appreciate the invitation.
and we will have you, but we'll take you up on that offer for you
Okay.
mentioned about plants. Yes, we did. Okay.
yes, definitely. That would be so helpful. Thank
Sounds
you
good.
all for coming. Thank
Yes.
you.
Yes. Thank you so much.